Hello and welcome to Off My Shelves, and in this episode we're going to be looking at Fear Agent by Rick Remender, Tony Moore and Jerome Pena, and yeah, we'll get underway. Now these two books I have been asked by various people to do an overview of, so this is very much a requested video for a few different people, and yeah, so before I get too far into the details as ever, I'm going to look at the build of the two books. Now they are library edition sizes, which means they are bigger than your standard Omnibus and Deluxe edition in height and in width. And yeah, these ones are published by Dark Horse Comics, and Fear Agent is being published by Image Comics as well, but only in trade paperbacks I think. And so these library editions are quite a while out of print, so they are very difficult to get. Each of the books contain around about 450-500 pages with extras at the end, but essentially about 300 to 400 story pages. These are all sewn binding, really well put together, really chunky books. Both of them are pretty much identical in build, apart from obviously the graphics on the front cover and the contents. Each of the books contain 3 trade paperbacks, 3 main story arcs of Fear Agent, starting obviously with volume 1, and that contains Reignition, My War and The Last Goodbye, and then volume 2 contains Hatchet Job, Eye Against Eye and Out of Step. They also do contain, which is very much of note because they are pretty substantial parts of each book, the tales of the Fear Agent, which we'll get a little bit more to towards the end of the video. The stories have very familiar Rick Remender tropes, and for those who've read any Rick Remender books, they always seem to have a very flawed, very depressed or addicted protagonist in some way, and Fear Agent was really the start for Rick Remender on this front, I think. Now Fear Agent all revolves around this main protagonist, Heath Hudson. It all starts off essentially giving you a really high-paced, action-packed opening to show you who Heath is and what he's all about, really. And essentially what you get from the first opening issues is that Heath is from Texas on Earth, and we catch up to Heath here in this first book 10 years on from him leaving Earth. Now, he left Earth because Earth was invaded by 2 warring alien parties, and both of them basically made Earth a battleground and uninhabitable by Earth's people. And so Heath fought along with everyone else in Texas who were left alive, and they called themselves Fear Agents. And you get a lot of the backstory of the Fear Agents and the occupation of Earth and the war on Earth in the final story arc of volume 1, so The Last Goodbye. That really delves deep into it. For the first 2 story arcs you get snippets of it, so you understand about it being 10 years on. You find out that he's had some devastating losses and family losses in his life, and it's really brought out the worst in his character in terms of alcoholism and depression and all that type of thing. So he has left Earth on a spaceship after that war, and now he is going around essentially being a pest control for different planets. He is a person that you hire to get rid of all these pesky infestations of alien life forms that are not as advanced in the books as humans, let's say. So the opening chapter really is a full blast kind of, head on, typical Rick Remender opening chapter way. Because I love Rick Remender's opening chapters because he always hits them with both barrels, and they're just action-packed beyond belief, and they always leave you wanting more and very intrigued by the character. And in fact, this first story arc leaves you in no uncertain terms as the type of person Heath is. He doesn't really care at all about himself. He's lost everything he cares about, and he's just out to kind of destroy himself through alcohol and through stupid decisions, really. And so he just keeps throwing himself into these more and more ridiculous situations. But he's also being cast into these ridiculous situations by people he has upset in some very significant ways. And for example, the Dressites and the Tadalians are 2 of these alien races that have these very deep-rooted problems with Heath Hudson, and they try their best to kind of get rid of him and get him out of the picture. But everything they try goes wrong, because Heath seems to be like the luckiest human being alive, because no matter what punishment happens to him, no matter how bad the situation seems, no matter how much drugs and how much alcohol he consumes, he still seems to survive. But he is very much your typical, extremely flawed action hero, really. Early on in the first story arc, every single science fiction trope you can imagine is thrown at you, and it is or can be, I should say, overwhelming. I'm sure certain readers would find the first opening arcs a little overwhelming, because there's everything from time travel to tons and tons of different alien races, to artificial intelligence, to robots kind of taking over people's bodies very much in the same way as the Cybermen or the Daleks from Doctor Who, that type of thing, and cloning, and it goes on and on and on. Honestly, so many of those very unique, typical scientific tropes that you would have experienced just growing up and being exposed to things like Doctor Who, I suppose, you find in here. But they done really well, and they don't jar to the story. They kind of just add on to this really high action, fast paced storyline. The first two story arcs are really very quick and very fast paced, because the opening story arc very much is showing you who Heath is. He's thrown instantly into this series of events that takes you right the way through to the end. And those series of events is him going back in time and finding himself on a planet that's dominated by the Tidalian race of robots, and robots mixing organic life with artificial life, and they want to dominate the globe. And then he sees an opportunity to change time, and the ramifications of him trying to alter his future and try to bring back the people he's lost is what affects this whole series. It keeps coming back time and time again. The art in it by Terry Moore and Jerome Pena is phenomenal, really. If you like kind of very expressive, cartoony expressions and wonderfully kind of creative action scenes, the two of them, one obviously taking over for the other, or some finishing the work the other started throughout both books, they're just great. And other artists and inkers do drip into the series, but those are the two real standouts of the series. Jerome Pena's art, though, I will say, for anyone who's familiar with Jerome Pena, he's almost at times doing his best Tony Moore impression, but as the series goes on, he very much finds his own way, and it starts to become more Jerome Pena-like. For those of you who've read his Avengers run or any other Rick Remender work that they've done together. At the end of the first story arc, Reignition, he finds himself in prison, and he picks up along the way Mara, who is his female companion early on, and she basically kind of tries to help him out. But he finds himself in prison and gets heavily addicted to different substances just to make the day pass easier, and then you were looking at the aftermath of that addiction. But also then what happens is he makes his way back to Earth, because at the end of issue 1 he discovers that the Dressites, this alien race, are going to infect the world with what's called these feeders, which are these destructive alien creatures that will decimate the Earth. But just as he's going to do something about it, he goes back in time and then goes off in different directions until he finally finds his way back to Earth. But then when he does get back to Earth, whole other sets of fear agents have been established on Earth when he's been away, and he finds out that some people who he thought had died hadn't died, but instead of going headlong into that story of the modern day Heath, the third story arc, as I said to you earlier, goes back then to 10 years before we start the story, and really lays down the foundations of how his family died, how Earth was invaded. And that is one of my favourite storylines, because when you start this book, you make some natural assumptions as to where Heath's come from and the time period and all that, but he's basically come from now the modern day, and two alien races rather, came to Earth and used it as a battleground. And how he has now got his own rocket ship, got a rocket pack, ray guns and all this type of stuff, is because the humans are actually scavenging off these two warring races and trying to utilise the technology off them to better their own chances of survival. And so you very much kind of get an idea that he's a bit of a homemade astronaut, really. At the end of the book as well, and at the end of this book, you get a series called The Tales of the Fear Agent. And these are shorter stories that are written and drawn by a whole range of different creators. And they very much look at the 10 years in between him leaving Earth and him ending up at the start of our story here. So those 10 years in between are never really explained in the main stories, so all the in-between bits are kind of taken over by other creators and other writers to just go out there and do what they fancy with it. There's a crazy range of artistry going on and a crazy range of stories going on, and I certainly recommend kind of jumping into them. The second volume then, as I said, collects the final 3 trades and then more of those fear agent tales really, and this pretty much continues directly on. Obviously all the story is one big narrative flow really, and Heath is very much kind of trying to find his place. Now, we left him at the end of the day discovering this new band of fear agents, discovering that other humans are fighting this battle that he's been fighting on his own to a certain degree, and he's kind of not fitting in right because other people see him for what he is, you know, an alcoholic, self-destructive nutter essentially. And so yeah, he really does struggle to fit in, but then equally he shines massively in moments because he is just this very absolutely cavalier, doesn't care action hero really, and so when the chips are down he'll just chuck himself in and really go at it, everything he's got, and that seems to work really well for him. But the opening story arcs are very much full of betrayal, very much full of lots and lots of death and destruction. But what this second arc does is it really delves deep, and I think as the book goes on in general really, the stories get far more in depth but far more downbeat as well. The first and second story arcs are very upbeat, and because of the amount of action and because of the heavy science fiction, they feel very light-hearted. But as you go on, it does get a very serious read, and a lot of people have a lot of issues with them, and Heath has punishment like you wouldn't believe. I mean, you think Batman's been through some punishment, Heath Hudson goes through it like you would not believe. And I can't really talk too much about volume 2 without directly spoiling volume 1 really, and spoiling a lot of the very interesting story twists and turns. But hopefully that gives you a decent enough idea of what to expect with Fear Agent. It is exceptionally well written and created, and it is certainly one of my favourite reads. Like I say, there is everything put into these books. Literally every science fiction trope that anyone would ever want to put into a science fiction book appears here. All these different ranges of characters, from very heroic characters to disgracefully obnoxious, horrible characters that are trying to dominate all life, all appear here. I very much like the character development through this whole thing really, and when it gets to the end and when certain things happen, it does really affect you emotionally. You do feel the ending of this whole story arc, and it leaves you happy and sad all at the same time. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed, and I will catch you on the next one.